Hello, I am Tyler Fallis, and I chose to do my project on use of slang as an indication of involvement in the LGBTQA plus community. So my central question for this was, does involvement in the LGBTQA plus community present a strong indication with the use of slang terms associated with that community? Or is it more influenced by gender identity and sexual orientation? And my hypothesis is that involvement will have a stronger correlation than expression of gender or sexuality. So the method that I chose to do in order to perform this was an anonymous Google form survey. I asked the following questions: what their primary language was, their country and or location, their age range, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, how involved in the LGBTQ community they were. So involvement might mean things like attending Pride or being involved in an organization such as the Trevor Project, or specifically following or supporting LGBTQ um, content creators. And then I also asked frequency of slang use of specific terms. So the terms that I chose to use to kind of test this indication, I chose both words that were associated with the community and some control terms that weren't necessarily associated. So the terms that I used that were associated were slay, yas, camp, queen, boy, bear, twink, throw shade, and spilling tea. Whereas my control terms were salty, dope, fire, lit, thirsty, and rad. So I had the questionnaire up for 24 hours, and in that period of time, I got 276 responses, which were mostly from U.S. and Canada, and were mostly English speakers primarily. One of the drawbacks or like unintended consequences of using my Twitter following for this was 82.2% of the people who took the questionnaire were cisgender male, with 9.8 non-binary. So that will definitely skew things, but this question can also just be answered in terms of um, males necessarily. And they were mostly my age, so 19 to 25. Um, this My Twitter following at least had a higher than average community involvement with the LGBTQ community, in which there's more of an even spread between about 1 and 7, whereas it would be much lower if we looked at a national scale. And the least used term was camp, which is kind of expected. It is a more obscure term, and the most used were salty and boy, which were used more frequently among everyone. So the first thing I needed to do was format the data, which I basically took anything that meant the same thing, whether they said Russian language or Russian, and combined those into one thing. I also chose to express language as a binary between English and non-English, just to account for people who had not necessarily had as much um, exposure to these English terms and slang terms, so that they did not necessarily throw off the data. Um, I also chose to express location as a binary because these terms are ones that I have heard used personally here in the US, and I can't speak for otherwise, so I wanted to kind of avoid regionalisms. And I chose gender to be expressed as a binary, but not the typical binary. I chose cisgender and non-cisgender because non-cisgender tend to have a higher correlation with LGBTQA plus involvement. And that involvement with that community was on a numeric scale from 1 to 10, and frequency of slang use was measured from 0 to 5. The way that I performed my data analysis was I did a multiple linear regression in R, which is a statistical package. The things I factored into this regression was the slang frequency of a particular term, was being influenced by involvement in the community, English, whether that was their first language, whether they were North American, whether they were cisgender, and what their orientation was. From I think there were 7 different ones that ended up showing up. I did have an enter your own, but I only had one other person answer anything there. Um, and this wiggle that you may see throughout here is basically used in order to show the density of points our um, because this data is set up in discrete points from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 1 through 10, all of the points overlap, and it's really hard to get kind of a gist of where the density is. So after performing these analysis, or these regressions, here are the outputs. Basically, a little explanation about this table. The two important parts are the estimate and the probability. So the estimate is basically telling us how much higher they would score if something is true, or so like for example here, whether they were English or not. If they were English, they used this term they scored it 0.3 lower than the average, which is actually a little surprising. Versus LGBT, which that involvement was on a scale from 1 to 10. So someone who scored their involvement as a 1 scored it about 1.4 points lower than someone who said it was central to their identity, or that on average rather. So that's about a difference of, I've used it once or twice to, I use it maybe every few months, up to even like, it's something I more regularly use. 1.4 is about 1.5, so that would be from I've used it rarely to I use it occasionally or even somewhat frequently. The probability is essentially telling us how probable is it that if I just plucked a random data set out of the air that I would come to these conclusions. And so in this case, a lower probability indicates that there is a very strong correlation. In the case of spilling tea here, this is basically saying that there is a 0.00002% chance that this is a random data set, which basically means that the correlation between LGBTQ involvement and the use of the term spilling tea is very, very significant. In this case, they scored it almost 2 points higher, or actually over 2 points higher on average. That's going from essentially they use it once or twice to almost daily. And something else of note, some of the orientations may seem rather high, but this is an on or off toggle versus the LGBTQ, which is 0 to 10. So you have to multiply that by 10 essentially. And also the orientation polysexual, there was only one response that indicated that they were polysexual, which means that it's a very influential point, and it's not necessarily indicative of all people. So other terms that were associated with this involvement but were not as high were camp, twink, throwing shade, and slay. They all had fairly low significance values, as well as about a half sort of variation between someone who wasn't involved and someone who was very involved with the community. So this is just basically showing that they were used more or less equally, and being cisgender or not usually did not have much of a effect on this. Like throwing shade, it only changed by 0.04. And then some other terms that are more of our control terms, these were kind of expected, had a very low correlation with LGBTQ involvement. So boy, which was actually associated with the LGBTQ community, but has sort of been appropriated and adopted by a larger speaker base. Fire, dope, and lit all had this happen, and then our lowest were salty, rad, and thirsty. Something worth noting is that every single one of these graphs had an upward trend in involvement to use. So that could be indicative that people who are more involved use all kinds of slang more frequently. So some conclusions is bear, queen, spilling tea, and yas all showed very significant correlation with LGBTQA plus community involvement, whereas um, the involvement always played a bigger role in frequency of slang use than sexual orientation, um, other than the case of polysexual, because that was an outlier. Um, and whether or not someone was cisgender or not, based on this data set, did not have a huge impact on these terms specifically. It would be interesting to look at a larger data set. And involvement in the LGBTQA plus community also had a positive correlation with slang use overall. And that, I think, wraps up this this study. Thank you very much.